With the release of the DJI Avata 2, we also saw DJI O4. This is their latest wireless digital system that DJI say offers improved range, lower latency, and better overall image quality. The real big change on O4 compared to what we had on O3 is the fact that it is a brand new RF chipset. It's not the first time that we've seen this chipset used in one of their new drones, but it is the first time we've seen it in an FPV related product. And today I'm going to share with you the results of my latency testing comparing O4 to the likes of O3 as well as the original DJI FPV system. In these results, you will also see the tests on the new 4K 100 mode that DJI have just introduced with the new firmware update on the Avata 2. This is something you may want to take note on because there is an interesting difference here compared to the other 100 frames a second modes in the lower resolutions. Now, for those who are new here, I've been doing latency testing on these systems for the last few years. I actually publish all of this data not only on the channel here in video format, but also on my wiki as well. You can find the charts that I'm going to show you here today on my FPV wiki, as well as the charts that we put together in the past as well. And I'll also put a link to my latency testing on O3 in the description of this video as well. Okay, so before we take a look at the data, I want to explain the effect that the recording modes have on latency. The way these systems work is you set your recording mode on your drone that you want for your footage. Your sensor is then told to give that frame rate out, and that is what's used to send to the DVR, and that image is then split off to send over to the live feed. As a result of that, you have to have the same frame rate on the live feed as you do recording, and this has a direct impact on the live view latency. For instance, the lowest latency you can have on these systems will be the highest frame rate mode that matches the goggles. What I mean by that specifically is as follows. The Goggles 2 and the Goggles 3 have 100 Hz or 100 frames a second OLED displays. The lowest latency will be the modes that match that frame rate. Whilst these drones do have a 120 frames a second mode, that is not matched to the displays of the goggle, and as a result of that, the 120 frames a second mode will have a higher latency than the 100 frames a second mode. When using the O3 system or the Avata 1 with the Goggles V2, for instance, the lowest latency mode will actually be 120 frames a second. However, when using them on the Goggles 2 and Integra, the lowest latency mode is 100 frames a second. That stands for the Avata 2 as well, because the Goggles 3, just like the Goggles 2, are limited to 100 Hz or 100 frames displays, and as a result of that, the lowest latency mode on this drone is always going to be the 100 frames a second modes. This causes a bit of a quandary or a downside for people who want the lowest possible latency but the best frame rate option for their flying. For instance, most people want to film in 25 or 30 frames a second. They don't like filming in higher frame rates, yet if you film with these drones on those lower frame rates, you're going to have much higher latency on the live view system than you would if you were recording and filming in the higher frame rates. This is often why you see people still wanting to fly these drones with the likes of a GoPro, because you can set your GoPro to say 30 frames a second, but have your live view in 100 frames a second, offering you the lowest possible latency. Now, there are a lot of people where latency really won't matter. However, it is worth understanding that there is more to the difference between these modes than just latency. It's the way they deliver the frames to the goggles as well. And there are many people who have said that when they're flying these systems in, say, 30 frames a second mode, it is extremely choppy, very variable latency, and in fact, some people find it so bad they can't actually use those modes. This actually bears out in the latency testing that I'm going to explain to you in a minute, but it is something that I did want to explain, and it is a compromise of having this all-in-one system where you don't have a separate recording camera from your live view camera, and unfortunately on these systems the latency will always be tied to the frame rate, and if you want the lowest latency you've got to have the ideal frame rate for the goggles, but unfortunately that isn't necessarily the ideal frame rate for filming. A lot of people also fall down the trap of thinking thinking that this 120 frames mode is going to offer lower latency than 100 when used with the Goggles 2 or the Goggles 3. However, as I've said already, that isn't the case. The frame rate has to match the goggles to have the lowest latency, and in fact, 120 frames a second mode on this is actually using 60 frames a second on the goggles, because you can't have randomized frame rates. It has to either be the same or halves of the original. Now, in the release of the Avata 2, DJI also stated something a little bit different compared to O3, and that was that the latency on the Avata 2 was capable of as low as 24 milliseconds. People who used the original DJI FPV system will know that that was capable of between 18 and 22, but when we had the release of O3, that increased to around 26 to 28 milliseconds. DJI have stated that the latency on the Avata 2 is lower than it is on O3, but it isn't something they're particularly advertising as a feature. It's just a number change in the specs. Next, I want to show you the results of my latency testing to see if anything has actually changed. Now, I'm going to walk you through the charts on this just to explain, though, what the process of doing this is first of all. For me to be able to do the latency testing, what I do is take two LEDs and point one at the camera on the drone and point one at the lens on the goggles. I then use a 1000 frames a second camera to measure the time difference between the two LEDs illuminating. The LEDs are synchronized and come on at exactly the same time, and what we then do is simply count the frames between the time the first LED comes on and then the image changing through the display in the goggles. Now, I have used this method in all of my latency testing, and if you haven't seen, I do have latency documents listed on my FPV wiki. There I have all the latency charts for the previous DJI system, the HD0 as well as Avatar HD, and I'm going to be publishing what info you see here in a minute onto that in the near future as well. Now, as I said, this chart is comparing O3 to O4, but there are two separate sets of numbers here. The first set on the left, we have O4 1080p stroke 2.7K 100 frames a second mode. This is the lowest latency mode that I have found on the O4 system. You can see the lowest average first pixel is 26 milliseconds, the average full frame is 35 milliseconds, and the lowest first pixel response is 26 milliseconds. As I mentioned earlier, the average first pixel and the lowest first pixel are the same. And what that tells you is it's a very consistent delivery of the frame pacing. In fact, we know this is the case on O3 and O4 because DJI have a form of FreeSync or a frame delivery smoothing in the lowest latency modes on O3 and O4. And as a result of that, you're seeing the very consistent results. Next, moving over to O3 combined with the Goggles 2 on 100 frames a second. And what you will notice is we basically have very similar numbers to O4, 26 milliseconds for the average, 26 milliseconds for the first pixel lowest, and 34 milliseconds for the average. That 35 to 34 milliseconds between O3 and O4 is negligible. That is just run-to-run variance. With regards to this, I would class those two as identical. The final interesting one is the one that's just behind me, and that is the new O4 4K 100 frames a second mode. For those who don't know, when the Avata 2 originally launched, it didn't have O4 capable of 100 frames a second in 4K. It was limited to 60, but DJI just introduced with the last firmware update the 100 frames a second mode in 4K, and here you can see the latency difference. What is interesting is the latency is very different between 2.7K and 1080p 100 and 4K 100. This basically means the new 4K 100 mode has much higher latency on the live view system than the 2.7K and 1080p mode. This isn't actually that surprising. For instance, on O3, we don't actually have a difference in the latency between 4K, 2.7K or 1080p 100. It is actually the same, whereas on the Avata 2, the latency on 4K 100 has gone up. That is most likely because of the amount of additional processing that is going on board with the Avata 2. For instance, the O3 Air unit and the Avata 2 basically have the same SoC for video processing. In fact, it's not basically the same, it is the same video SoC for processing. However, DJI actually run the flight control stack, all of the visual image processing for the visual positioning system, return to home, and all of that software on the same SoC as well. And as a result of that, the O3 air unit is doing a lot less work than, say, the Avata 2 is, and that is because the O3 air unit isn't running a flight stack, it's not having to do all of the visual positioning and all of the flight control, and as a result of that, DJI can dedicate more resources to processing the video. We don't know that this is 100% the case, but it is most likely the reason. What this does show you, though, is that the new 4K 100 mode does not have the same low latency as the 1080p or 2.7K 100 mode, and this is a departure from what we'd seen on the likes of the O3 air unit before. We can't compare this, though, to what we had on the original Avata, because DJI didn't introduce 4K 100 on the original Avata, again, most likely due to the fact that that same SoC that does the image processing also does the flight control, and it was heading for the point of just there wasn't enough video resources. In the end, what the Avata 2 is trying to do is incredibly difficult. It's not only trying to encode 4K 100 frames per second video onto the SD card, but it's then also encoding a separate live view 1080p stream at 100 frames a second as well, and there is a point where there simply isn't enough resources to do it, and that is what we believe is causing this. And as I have already mentioned, whilst O3 doesn't do this, I would not expect any standalone O4 air unit to do it as well. I would expect that to behave more like the O3 air unit, because again, the air unit is not running the flight control, it's not having to do all of the visual stuff, the positioning and all of that is having to be done on the drone itself. The Avata is quite unusual compared to DJI's older models. In the past, DJI would run their flight control on one SoC, the video processing on a separate SoC, the visual positioning on separate processing as well, whereas today on the Avata 2, and the Avata 1 was one of their first drones to do this, DJI combined everything onto the Eagle 3T. The big change between the Avata 1 and the Avata 2 is the fact that they've now moved over to the S2 chipset with regards to the RF system, but that doesn't mean there's any additional processing there for video. As I've said, it uses the same Eagle 3T processor, which means it's having to do everything on board the one chip. Now, just showing you O3 versus O4 on all of the different modes, but also throwing in the original FPV system as well. Looking at the left, what you will see is the lowest latency DJI FPV system is the original one, which is the Air Unit or the Caddx Vista RunCam Link. You've got an average first pixel of 20 milliseconds, lowest first pixel of 18 milliseconds, and 30 milliseconds for full frame. There, you can see a 2 millisecond difference between the average first pixel and the lowest. That is because of the frame delivery on the V2 goggles. It isn't particularly good, and there is a bit of a variance. Then we obviously have O4 at 1080p 2.7K and O3, which are basically the same. As I've said already, whilst there's 1 millisecond difference between O3 and O4 at the full frame, that is just run-to-run stuff. As far as I'm concerned, it's basically the same. Then you have that new 4K 100 frames a second mode. This is actually basically coming out very similar to the O4 120, O3 120. It is a little bit lower latency, but it is dramatically higher than we see on the low latency modes. And then looking up the chart, everything is actually looking very similar. Overall, O4 does have a little bit of lower latency compared to its O3 counterparts. So if we look at O460 versus O360, 41 to 44 milliseconds on the average first pixel, 57 to 61, and then 40 to 43. It's a little bit lower. I don't think it's anything that's going to make a massive difference to anyone in the real world, but it is worth noting. About the only outlier here alongside that O4 4K mode in 100 frames a second is the O4 in 30 frames a second. It was bad enough on O3. It is higher though on O4. You can see the first pixel average 61 milliseconds, average full frame at 81 milliseconds, and lowest first pixel at 53. This is even worse than what we'd seen on the O3 air unit or the original Avata, and it was bad enough there. So again, if people are flying in these modes, you do need to take into account that the O4 30 frames a second mode is by far the highest latency. Obviously, this is what we are seeing on the Avata 2. I will be rerunning all of these tests again on the O4 air unit at some point when that arrives. That's an inevitability. However, here and now, what it does do is give you an indication of how the two systems compare. Now, all of that latency testing was done on the Avata 2 when paired to the Goggles 3 as it came at release. Since then, though, DJI have released new firmware that adds support for the Avata 2 on the Goggles 2. Now, in theory, there should be no difference in latency between the Goggles 3 and the Goggles 2. They both have the same OLED displays. They both have the same video processing chipset. In theory, it should be the same. However, as you're about to see, that isn't the case. Now, I haven't done testing in all the modes. I've just concentrated on the lowest latency modes right now, which is 2.7K and 1080p 100, as well as 4K 100, because we know on the Goggles 3 there is a difference. As you can see here on the chart, things aren't quite as I would have expected. For instance, the DJI Avata 2 on the Goggles 2 compared to the Avata 2 on the Goggles 3 is showing a pretty much consistent 5 millisecond increase in latency. It is very stable in my testing that it is 5 milliseconds more. There's not really any variance in that, and that is also bared out by the fact that the lowest first pixel and the average first pixel numbers are the same. That is tested at 2.7K stroke 1080p 100 frames a second. When we then move up to 4K 100, and as I showed earlier, we already know that that has higher latency, it is even worse on the Goggles 2 with the Avata 2, with it jumping up from 42 milliseconds on average to the first pixel to 51, whereas there is a smaller gap though between the full frame jumping up 3 milliseconds. You'll also notice the big difference between the average first pixel and the lowest first pixel being 46 to 51. Looking at the latency testing, it's actually quite apparent how variable the 4K 100 mode is when paired to the Goggles 2. Now, as I mentioned already, there is technically no good reason as far as I'm concerned for the Goggles 3 to have lower latency than the Goggles 2. Both have the same displays, both have the same refresh rate, both have the same image processing. Yes, there is a difference in the video chipset. The Goggles 3 do support the new S2 chipset, which does allow up to 60 megahertz carrier or 60 megabits a second, but the Goggles 2 can still do the 40 megahertz carrier 50 megabits a second, just like it does on O3. And as I showed on the chart, O3 was listed. There is no reason for it to be any higher here than it is here. And this is something I think DJI probably need to look at. I'm not sure if it's intentional or not. It may be a bug, but what is clear is that the Goggles 2 are not getting the same low latency modes as you're getting on the Goggles 3. Okay, so to try and summarize this all, now, as I've shown, there is a lot to understand here, but the very basics are the Avata 2, when paired with the Goggles 3, basically offers the same latency as the O3 system in its lowest latency mode. I know DJI specs are saying as low as 24 milliseconds. I'm not seeing that in my testing, but I'm not calling DJI a liar here. We are testing things one way, DJI are testing them another. I'm not saying it isn't possible that at some point it may get down to 24 milliseconds instead of the 26 that I've seen. It's just maybe I've not done enough testing to be able to see that. In my tests, and I've done a lot of it, the lowest I've seen is 26 milliseconds, but for all we know, DJI is logging latency data in the background, and at some point they've had it go as low as 24 milliseconds, and that's what they've put on the marketing material. The reality is, O4 on the Goggles 3 with the Avata 2 is no lower than the O3 system. The only quirks are this difference in the way it behaves between the modes. So for instance, 1080p 2.7K has lower latency than the 4K 100 frames a second mode. But that, as I've mentioned already, is likely as a result of the way DJI is having to do all of the image processing on board, and we're probably at the point of the Avata 2 struggling to be able to do the flight control, to do everything alongside that video processing as well. With regards to using the Avata 2 with the Goggles 2, that was a bit of a surprise. Again, I've already said it, but I see no technical reason the latency should be higher, and I'm not saying it's intentional, but I do think DJI have a bit of work to do here. Right now, though, as I've shown in the charts, the Avata 2 with the Goggles 2 does not have the same lowest latency as you get on the Goggles 3, and it is substantially higher overall, 5 milliseconds at best, but when you move into that 4K 100 mode, it is substantial. Overall, the reality is if you want the lowest possible latency from the Avata 2, you need to use it in 1080p or 2.7K 100 modes, All of the other modes are not low latency. That includes 120, as I've already said. When using it on the Goggles 2, again, the situation is the same. 1080p or 2.7K 100 is going to give you the lowest overall numbers. The charts that you've seen here today will be published on my FPV wiki. If you don't know, I have a wiki where I publish all of my latency testing data. These new charts will be going up there before this video goes live. There will be a link to that in the description. You will also find there the teardown images for the Avata 2, the Goggles 3, and all of the other stuff that I've torn down over the years, so please do consider checking it out. Now, I really hope you have found this video interesting. I hope you have got some information that you haven't found anywhere else. If you have, please do consider supporting the channel. There is a link to my Patreon as well as buy me a coffee in the description. It is only through the support of my patrons am I able to keep making content on this channel. And if you'd like to support us to allow us to keep making content in the future, please do consider checking it out. I want to say a huge thank you to all of my Patreons. I would not be able to keep doing this without your support. Okay, so that's it from me on this one. Stay safe. I will speak to you soon.